All right, so Periscope LHLS media streaming. So first, to motivate why we need something other than just HLS. So what is Periscope? If you've not used it, it's an interactive live streaming application, and the broadcaster can receive comments and chat feedback and hearts from the audience. And what's appealing about a live streaming application like Periscope is the interactivity that you get as a broadcaster with your audience, and as the audience with, maybe it's a comedian or something that you follow, and all of a sudden they're talking to you, and it's pretty amazing. But in order to get that feeling of interactivity, the latency between the time that something happens in front of the camera and when you see it as a viewer, and then are able to chat about it and hear feedback from the broadcaster, that latency needs to be kept pretty short. The team found that 2 seconds was really good for the latency. That's sort of glass to glass. 5 seconds, would be the end of the range. And the audience, I guess when Periscope was not launched yet, it wasn't clear how big the audience would be for a particular broadcast. So it wasn't clear how that low latency streaming would have to scale to what size of a crowd. So at the time of launch, the Periscope sort of streaming architecture looked like this. So starting at the lower left, the broadcaster would be streaming to a media server using RTMP over 443, but just RTMP. I would say RTMP-S, but I think that has connotations other than just streaming over 443, but that's what we do. And so we hit the media server, and the first 100 people that watched, if you joined the broadcast, you would get a dedicated RTMP stream. And after 100, there'd be a spillover crowd, and you would get an HLS stream. And so if you were in the first 100, or when you joined the broadcast, there were fewer than 100 other people watching, you would be able to chat. And so that was great. But if you were in the later, then it would show chat room is full, and you wouldn't be able to chat. And so this allowed us to scale to a large audience, and we kind of had the rationale that broadcasters would be overwhelmed if you had 10,000 people sending you comments. There's no way you would read it. And there was some pretty bad broadcasts. I think the Warriors had just won the whatever that is, basketball, I think. And so some of the players were on Periscope, and they were just being barraged, and they just looked bewildered, and it was like, oh, we have to fix that. So even 100 people chatting was too much. We would like to be able to determine who's chatting and what chats the broadcaster might see. We don't want it necessarily have to be a limitation of our streaming architecture. We should be able to serve low latency to everybody, and then determine who's going to chat or what chats are acceptable to show to the broadcaster. So that's one of the downsides of this hybrid architecture, is that not all viewers can actually get the latency target that we want. Another big downside was that the egress bandwidth for RTMP, for those 100 viewers, ended up being our number one operational cost. We're in AWS in a bunch of regions, and that's what we were paying for. We were paying for all those individual streams, the egress bandwidth out of AWS. Another issue is that when a broadcaster would decide to broadcast, we had a service that would do latency-based routing, and we could figure out what our nearest point of presence was to that broadcaster. But then anybody that wanted to watch over RTMPS, or suppose that broadcaster was in Paris, and then they would hit Frankfurt, and then someone wanted to watch from Sydney, and then we'd have a TCP connection from Sydney to Frankfurt. It's 200 milliseconds or more, I don't know. So it's a long round trip time, and so if they have any packet loss, their throughput is pretty bad. So not the best. So we decided to try to find a way to get the goodness of streaming over HTTP, with CDN and scalability, but with the latency that we were getting over RTMP. And there's nothing special about RTMP. We just needed a point-to-point of sort of low latency protocol, and that's what our sort of third-party streaming service did well initially, and then we built our own. Okay, so where is the latency coming from in HTTP-based streaming? So the first bit of latency that I'll sort of talk about, I'm calling segmentation latency, and that's, if you have like HLS, HTTP-based streaming protocol, you have a manifest, and that gets updated every time a segment is completed. But you can't actually add a segment to that manifest until it's completed. So if your segment is 2 seconds long, the first frame in that segment is 2 seconds old by the time anybody could actually request it, let alone see it. So the first sort of downside is segmentation latency. Yeah, so why don't we just make the segments really short? If the segment's 500 milliseconds long, then, segmentation latency isn't so bad. But I think most of you know, I think it's a pretty technical crowd, but I wasn't sure. So you can't really do that if you want to have IDR frames at the beginning of every segment, which allows you to have sort of random access. You'd be able to start at any segment, because IDR frames are many, many times larger than the rest of the frames. And so the more frequent you have IDR frames, the lower your quality is going to be at a given bit rate. And it's pretty significant. So here I'm showing just a trace for some, I don't know, this is like a news clip. And you see that I frames are maybe, 6 times larger than P frames, and maybe 30 times larger than the B frames in this particular clip. So you don't want to make your segments too short, because then you're going to have bad quality for whatever bit rate you're streaming at. Relatively bad quality. The other kind of latency I'm calling manifest latency. And what this means is, suppose you are the viewer on the upper right. And so you request, I get a URL from the API, and I want to watch the stream. So you ask for the playlist. So your request maybe misses in the edge. Maybe you're the first person that wants to watch it, and then we shield the origin from getting too many requests. And so it misses there, and then it goes to the back end. And maybe the back end is just about to complete a segment. So the playlist that you get is almost two seconds old. So you have latency there. And so if you were to then turn around and request the segment that appears on that 2-second old playlist, segmentation latency plus manifest latency is like 4 seconds. So we're pretty much out of latency budget already. Now suppose you're a viewer on the bottom, and a second later you make a request, and maybe you're in the same POP, maybe you're at a different POP. Either way, it's going to go to the origin, let's say, or origin shield, or maybe it's just going to your local POP. But we have to set a TTL on the playlist so that we're not serving every playlist out of the back end. And a TTL, I think, am I wrong? The minimum is 1 second, right? It's in seconds. So anyway, the viewer there can have a manifest at 3 seconds latent. So 3 seconds plus 2 seconds of segmentation latency. There's a latency budget, and we haven't buffered anything at the client, which is where your latency should be. So how do we get around segmentation latency and manifest latency? So that's what HLS attempts to do. It's just a little sort of tweak on HLS that kind of doesn't follow the letter of the standard. If you were to read the RFC, it says don't do this. So how do we eliminate segmentation and manifest latency? Well, the first idea is to use chunk transfer coding. So we don't have to complete a segment before we start sending it down. We can use a chunk encoded transfer. And then when you make a request for a segment, we can send you frames as they arrive from the broadcaster. But in order to make that happen, another thing we need to do is add segments to the manifest early before they're actually live, before we actually have any media to put in them. Does everybody know what chunk transfer coding is? Is that like common knowledge? Usually when you make if you have an HTTP server and it responds to a request, it'll say, here's the size of the response, and then it'll send the response. But in a chunked response, you would just say, I'm going to do a chunk response as the server, and you send chunks, and when you're done, you say, I'm done. That's the difference. And the whole point of it is that, to enable sort of low latency streaming stuff, but maybe not for media in its initial intention. Okay, so I want to compare LHLS and HLS in this slide, and this is probably the hardest one to talk through, so hopefully I do it. So in the top, so here we have the server, the broadcaster is streaming up to the server, and then we have segments that have been completed. Segment 1 was done, segment 2 is done, segment 3 is done, and the current HLS playlist, if you were going to make a request at the time of this example, would contain segment 1, 2, and 3, because segment 4 is still in the process of being completed. So if you were to request that and you didn't have manifest latency, you would still have, lots of latency in the playlist, right? Because you're buffering all that stuff and all that, you've already got, like if they're 2-second segments, which is my example, but it doesn't have to be 2 seconds, you've got 6 seconds of latency there. I think that's right. But for the LHLS playlist that you request, the segment number 4 that is actually still being filled up with TS chunks, like as frames arrive from the broadcaster, muxed into TS and put in that segment, is already advertised in the playlist. And not only that, segment 5 and segment 6, and maybe further segments, are all advertised in that playlist. So you make a request as an LHLS player, and you immediately try to request segment 4, 5, and 6. You open up sockets and you grab those segments. And so for segment 4, you get some frames that have already been placed into segment 4 using a, you get a chunk response from the server. And then as frames are placed into that segment, you get a frame sort of at the frame rate or something like that. And meanwhile, segments 5 and 6, those requests are just hanging. The server will send you some boilerplate, PMT, PAT headers and the TS chunks corresponding to those. But then you'll receive nothing until segment 4 is done. And then when the server is completed 4, it'll start filling segment 5, those segments. So anybody that's requested segment 5 is going to start getting chunks from segment 5 as frames arrive. And that's it. Thanks. OK. OK. Actually, one big concern when we were doing a proof of concept was, hey, is our CDN going to make this possible? Because first of all, the CDN has to not aggregate segments before they forward them on. That would basically break it. And then what happens if someone has made a request for a segment and that's response is ongoing, and then someone else makes another request for that segment? What's going to happen? So it turns out for our CDN vendor, what happened was it did the right thing. So suppose the top client there that I've labeled viewer made a request for segment 4, and as soon as it made the request, segment 4 was already partially completed. So it would get all those chunks right away, and then it would start receiving chunks, or chunks, TS chunks, like those 188 byte chunks, at the rate at which they're arriving from the broadcaster and being muxed. And now suppose the other viewer, whether it's in the same edge pop or whether it's going back to the shield cache, requests segment 4 as well. It will receive whatever has been completed by the time its request hits the cache, and then it will also get chunks of media as they arrive from the broadcaster, which is the desired behavior. And then there's only one request backended to the server, because that's one of the things we're trying to do. If they were both backended or n were backended, then our whole scalability issue hasn't been fixed. So our CDN does the right thing. OK, so now let's look at these plots. I have 2 plots kind of trying to illustrate a little more. So we have the maximum video PTS received in seconds as a function of time, and this is comparing HLS and LHLS. So you'll see that for HLS, they're both buffering 4 seconds, and so there's a sort of they're able to pull 4 seconds of media that have already been completed initially, and then basically the HLS arrivals at the client come in bursts. A segment has been added to the playlist. The client is pulled and gotten the new playlist, and then that segment's worth of frames is added to the playback buffer. So you see it's going up in a staircase fashion. Whereas for LHLS, it makes requests on a bunch of segments that haven't actually started yet, but one of them has, and it's getting frames at a time. And you see that you basically get kind of a straight line plot. You'll see that the segment, kind of, if you were brilliant, you'd see, no, I'm just joking, but the segment duration for HLS is 2 seconds here, but because of hiccups in sort of staleness when it's polling for the manifest, sometimes it won't get the new one when it polls. And so you'll see that sometimes it doesn't get the new segment for 2 segment durations. So what does this mean in terms of your playback buffer? So what I'm showing here now, it kind of looks like the derivative of the previous plot. It's the playback buffer occupancy as a function of time. So both HLS and LHLS clients are buffering 4 seconds, and then playback begins. And since frame arrivals over LHLS are at the frame rate, the buffer stays pretty constant until there's a hiccup in the throughput around 20 seconds. But for HLS, rather, you get a bunch of you get a segment, and then you're playing out of your playback buffer, and then after a segment period, you get another segment. And so you have this sawtooth. And every time you are at the bottom of the sawtooth, you're closer to being in a stall state, right? So it's another way to illustrate the benefit of this scheme. OK, so here's some questions that you might have. What about all those open sockets? You're going to have a playlist and you're going to open up requests that last 10 seconds because they're at the bottom of the list. Is that cool? So we worried about that. Our CDN vendor was like, yeah, that's fine. But what are they going to say? So what we've decided to do is, just use HTTP2, and then it's all multiplexed over the same socket anyway, so we're cool. What about duration and discontinuity tags? So in an HLS playlist, you're supposed to indicate that there's going to be a discontinuity in timestamps, or maybe you've changed your media, you got to put a tag in there. And how could we possibly know? Because we don't even know what's going to be in that segment yet. And also, we don't know the duration of the segment because we haven't muxed it yet. And we have flaky broadcasters, and maybe they're not going to give us an IDR frame, and the segment might end up being kind of long. So the answer is we implemented our clients, and we had to just to do the LHLS stuff, and they don't rely on them. But maybe if a client does, like an HLS player, some AV player, or whatever, we're able to, the segments, when they're completed, are, fine for HLS. So we have a number of different consumers of our, media, and so if they're using a stock HLS player, not one of ours, then we'll give them the HLS playlist, and then we'll know about discontinuities and segment durations. But then for the low latency clients, we can just sort of ignore that stuff. And then another question that might come up is, what about bandwidth estimation? Often you can do bandwidth estimation just by making a request, seeing how big it is, and then figuring out how long it took. And then oh, we've got plenty more bandwidth, let's upswitch. But in our case, you're never going to, if you do that, you'll never see a bandwidth higher than the rate of the media, because it's arriving at the rate of the media. So we have to do something different. So we use some heuristics, and honestly, we're iterating on that. But it works. So that's the end of my talk. What did I talk about? I said that we launched and we had basically RTMP that met our latency requirements, but it wouldn't scale. And then we had HLS, which would scale, but it didn't meet our latency requirements. So we invented what we're calling LHLS, which is just like a little tweak on HLS that allows us to have the latency of RTMP and scale like HLS. And it's been working for us. We've been doing this in our metrics like stall rates and time to first frame and other metrics that you might think of have been really good compared to RTMP. So thanks, and I'm ready to take your questions, I guess. I think one sort of guiding principle was to make it as similar to HLS as we could, so we didn't have to reinvent too much stuff. And also, we have clients that are going to be consuming HLS, and so this whole sort of just advertising things early kind of works. So maybe we could do something like that, but it wasn't there wasn't anything driving us to sort of invent that. Now we've done. This is kind of the vanilla stuff. We've had to do some interesting things. Actually, Benjamin, my colleague here, has done some interesting things to try to tailor the startup latency and the amount of buffering that we get for the conditions that we're seeing coming up from the broadcaster. So just adding tags to the playlist and things that will help the client to sort of decide, given a playlist that has some latency in it, like maybe the first few segments listed are pretty old, overlapping with the HLS playlist, and trying to make your startup times quick and still give you the buffer that you want. And so you can decide as a client based on information we can give you from the API to do that. I didn't talk about transcoding at all, like adaptive bitrate, but that's part of this, and having our transcode service, which is kind of interesting, and it's another talk, to be able to produce variants with this low latency, with less than a segmentation latency, segments worth of latency. There's been talk about let's open source everything, because then we'd have people to help us figure out what's wrong with their stuff. So I could see that happening. It's a great question. I know my roadmap that I have to go and do, but the bigger picture kind of eludes me at this moment, unless you can direct me in something you would like to see. Actually, I think that when we actually released this, we had done some testing, it was kind of anecdotal, and we're like, yeah, this works great. Our P90, time to get a frame from the broadcaster. I'm saying P90, maybe I'll say P50. Time to get a frame from the broadcaster till it arrives at the client so we can put it at the buffer. It was a couple hundred milliseconds. It was amazing. We're like, wow. So we went out with, 2 seconds of buffering. That's all we need. And I think we got some stalls. So we increase that a little bit. Actually, we have done some work to sort of try to determine on an adaptive basis, like what's the right target buffer. That's right. So we have that all implemented and sort of rolling out with it. But frankly, right now, when we do adaptive bitrate, and we don't do that for all of Periscopes because a lot of times 4 people are watching, and we're not going to transcode like 4 variants for you. Sorry. It's like we're not making enough money on that stream. So when we do have transcoded content right now, we're actually using quite a bit of more latency, more like HLS. And so we're tuning and being able to make it so that if there is an interactive broadcast, we can have transcoded variants and it still is in that same latency region. Cool,